Ishiro Honda once said that the tragedy of monsters is the fact that they are born too tall, too strong, and too heavy. And at least in the context of the films, he was right. These attributes have led to Godzilla having many disagreements with the Japanese military. But at least in the context of pop culture, these attributes have led to the opposite for Godzilla. They've allowed him to prosper and produce 28 movies. But I want to analyze this and discover what it truly is about Godzilla that attracts people to him and why he's been so endearing. And the only way to truly do that successfully is to review every Godzilla movie ever made. Some people might be angry, but regardless, welcome to Zazubaar's Godzilla Palooza. Greetings, United Nations newsroom. I am Zazubaar, and welcome back to Godzilla Palooza. It's still day 4, and welcome to part 2 of our review of the 1962 film King Kong vs. Godzilla. Earlier today, we took a look at the Japanese cut of King Kong vs. Godzilla, and we talked about how it had allegory that didn't fit, and how it had music that didn't fit, and ultimately was strangely paced. Well, now we're going to get into the American cut of the film, which cuts out a lot of that and changes a lot of that, so this should make for an interesting review. I'm also hoping this review is going to be a lot shorter than the hour-long analysis of King Kong vs. Godzilla, because I don't have a ton to say about the American cut. Basically, I just want to talk about what's different and why I kind of think it works better as a monster movie, or as a, well, not as a Godzilla movie, but as a movie I think it works better. We'll get into that in a minute. But before we get into the review itself, I thought that I would be remiss not to talk about my specific nostalgia for this cut of the movie. I talked about earlier today how I have nostalgia for both cuts because they're both ultimately very similar, and you know, they're basically the same movie, just with minute differences. But this is the cut that I have the most nostalgia for. I remember almost every music cue, every English dubbed and written line. I remember this specific edit. You know, all this stuff captured my imagination as a child and has been burned into my memory. So whenever I watch the American cut, I can't help but feel like I'm a 5-year-old again watching this on Saturday morning and just being captured by it, engrossed, and letting my imagination run wild. And I don't know if anyone else out there had the same experience with King Kong vs. Godzilla, but this cut captured my imagination and truly did change my life. So I'm not going to begrudge the Japanese cut because I didn't see it, but this is the cut I have nostalgia for. So I just wanted to talk about that before we get into the review. So now let's talk about the big difference immediately from the Japanese cut is just like Godzilla King of the Monsters, American shot scenes with American actors are added in to the American cut of King Kong vs. Godzilla, which were shot by Universal and directed by John Beck. And I think almost all of the American shot scenes take place in the UN newsroom, and well, multiple UN newsrooms, but they basically just take place in a newsroom, and have the different reporters reporting on what's going on in the film and doing commentary on the events going on with Kong and Godzilla and the events surrounding their fight. So it's not quite as difficult to put in and not quite as impactful on the plot as adding Raymond Burr into Godzilla King of the Monsters was, but it still changes the plot a lot since a lot of the exposition is cut out. because it's being replaced by all these scenes of American news reporter Eric Carter and a paleontologist named Howard Johnson and Japanese UN reporter whose name escapes me. But there's basically a Japanese bureau of the UN news group that Eric Carter, the main American actor in the film, and there's a correspondent in Tokyo who is a Japanese actor or Japanese American actor. Which I couldn't even tell that he was a Japanese American until I looked it up. He looked strangely Caucasian to me. I know a lot of you were going to disagree with that just by looking at him on the screen right now, but when I was a kid, I always thought he was Caucasian. So, just saying. And again, thus with the American actors explaining certain expositional points like Godzilla being encased in the iceberg, what the Seahawks' point of going out is, where and why Sakurai and Tokyo Television are going to Faroe Island to get Kong. All the stuff with the Japanese actors that exposits upon that is for the most part cut out. Some of the stuff with Tokyo Television is left in just because there's no way that Eric Carter would be able to know that, so they have to dub those scenes, but otherwise a lot of the exposition is cut out. And all we really get are the American actors introducing something and then the Japanese footage, it happens. It's a strange structure, and it's not completely the same as King of the Monsters was, because again, it doesn't drastically affect the plot like King of the Monsters did. Sure, we have a reporter again, but with King of the Monsters, we had to have Steve Martin be right in the moment of what's going on. With Eric Carter, this is a guy sitting in New York getting all this information from a satellite. So you don't have to alter scenes or the plot so that way it would be believable that he could be there. You can basically just have the Japanese cut run just with Eric Carter commentating on things happening. So unlike King of the Monsters, most of the scenes are still the same, and there's no drastic edits to make them work. I'm not going to do a plot synopsis in this review because it would be ultimately pointless, because the plot, again, is the same. They just cut out all the exposition and replaced it with Eric Carter and Dr. Johnson and the Japanese reporter, whose name escapes me, expositing on what's happening. And ultimately, what I'm surprised at watching it for this review is that there is ultimately a lot more dubbing than I remember. It's been like a year or so since I've watched this movie, and I remember there being less dubbing than there is, and I ultimately have to question the use of the American actors because the dubbing is so good that it ultimately seems pointless. I mean, not to begrudge the American scenes, I think they're well done, and for basically just being a news reporter with no character depth or personality, he's pretty well written with Eric Carter, and the acting is fine for being a news reporter, but I'm ultimately just left scratching my head as to why we needed those scenes. Like, I really feel like the well-done dub job on King Kong vs. Godzilla makes me wonder why there even are American shot scenes, because the dubbing is so great. And ultimately the American scenes, unlike with King of the Monsters where the American scenes started to not be as frequent with Steve Martin as the film went on, they're constantly coming in at a constant clip, at a constant pace throughout King Kong vs. Godzilla. We never stop having them. Every time a major event in the film is about to happen, except for the part where Kong gets the airlift, there's really nothing around that. But basically every other part, the news reporters, Eric Carter, and the Japanese reporter are always commentating on what's happening and telling the viewer what is about to happen. Like Godzilla's heading towards Tokyo, or Kong and Godzilla are heading on a path to intersect each other. Really the only parts that don't have any of those American intercepts is from the Kong airlift to the middle of the fight, and then they start popping up again until the film ends. So again, I find it strange because again, the film is very well dubbed. All the American voice actors that are brought in to play the Japanese characters all fit their Japanese actors' performance, and I think that's good. And not to say that Toho's roster of actors isn't good. I'm just trying to say that I appreciate both the American voice actors' jobs at capturing the Japanese actors' performances, which in some cases is actually better, but also I appreciate and probably ultimately prefer the Japanese actors' performance in the subtitles. But I think the dubbing is great, and I feel like all the actors capture their Japanese actors' performance and their characters' personality, so I like that. In fact, I like Taco better in the American cut, and ultimately I don't love him anyway, but I think he's toned down a lot from the crazy psychopath that he is in King Kong vs. Godzilla, and he's basically a cartoon character, and a lot of his comedy scenes are cut out, and he ultimately just seems like a really eccentric head of an advertising agency where he's kind of crazy because he's at the mercy of commercialism. So the way he is in this film makes a lot more sense than the way he is in the Japanese cut, and I like that better. Here's the thing. Here's the big thing that's cut out in the American version is the allegory and the satire. Thank God. I know that not all you are going to agree because you're saying, oh, the movie's not as deep and all that stuff. But here's the thing. It didn't really do anything for the film in the Japanese cut anyway. Like, it didn't make it any more deep and better than it already was without that. And the American cut works much better as a straightforward sci-fi movie without those scenes of satire because it makes the film feel more serious. And ultimately that's better than the goofy sci-fi, not sci-fi, but the goofy satire we get in the Japanese cut. And I appreciate their attempt at making this a straightforward sci-fi movie because that's ultimately what I thought the Japanese cut should have been anyway. My only problem with cutting out all that stuff is that it leads to a really imbalanced tone between the American shot scenes and the Japanese shot scenes in that, again, the characters are toned down a lot from their cartoonish characters in the Japanese cut, but even in the American cut, no matter how much you dub and edit, you cannot tone down those characters to a point where they're real people because you just can't do it. They're too silly. And then when you cut back to these dead serious American shot scenes, it's awkward. And ultimately, it makes the movie ultimately feel like scenes were added in later, and it makes it a very strange experience to watch. And I don't really know how to describe it. It's just that the tone is imbalanced because we got these goofy scenes, and then we've got these dead serious scenes, and it ultimately doesn't work. So I talked about the dubbing, and I talked about the allegory. Again, it's totally cut out of the American version. It is just a straightforward monster movie, and I ultimately think it benefits from that. It's not hurt by that. And I feel like the reason why it ultimately works so well to help the film is that it makes the King Kong and Godzilla stuff feel more to the point, and it feels more focused on the monster battles and the monster scenes rather than worrying about this allegory that comes out of nowhere. And I feel like the film is better paced for that. Like, there's no scenes that drag of, commercialism, satire. And again, in the Japanese cut, I thought it was fairly well done, and I felt like Honda and Sekizawa knew what they wanted to do. But again, it didn't fit with what they were trying, with the movie they were making. And in this film, with it cut out, the movie feels a lot more succinct than it did with the Japanese cut, which had this random allegory thrown in. Also, and I knew I obsessed over this a little bit in the first part of my King Kong vs. Godzilla review, but that strange line by Akihiko Hirata's character at the end of the film is also cut out. He just talks about how he's glad that Godzilla's gone. And I ultimately like that as well. I'm just trying to look at my notes here and see exactly what I want to cover. Again, I don't have a ton to say about this cut because ultimately I just think it works better than the Japanese cut because all the fat is cut out. Because it literally is just a straightforward monster movie, and, disagree with me all you want about cutting out Honda's allegory and cutting out all the Japanese scenes that were cut out and dubbing the film, but I ultimately think, just for the sake of pacing and the story working better, I just ultimately think that the American version works better. In those regards. There's one last thing I want to cover what the difference is, and this is going to be more where the plot differences start to come in. Not so much plot, but just where scenes are different. The big thing is Godzilla appearing, because I complained in the Japanese version that the Godzilla story moves way slower than it should compared to the King Kong story, and the American version also rectifies that by having Godzilla appear in the first act, go missing for most of the second act, appear in the second act again, attack Hokkaido, then start moving towards Tokyo when Kong is already en route to Japan. That was a lot. It was differently put together in the Japanese version and made less sense with what was going on with Kong. Not only did this one make more sense, but it makes the stories feel like they're going in a much more natural pace. And it makes the Godzilla scenes seem more close together, so that way it seems like he's doing more in less time. So it feels better paced with the King Kong story. And when you speed up the Godzilla story, you ultimately slow down the King Kong story. I know that doesn't sound like it makes any sense, because then you would think, oh, but if you're putting all the Godzilla scenes in one place, then King Kong's going to go by quicker. No, not really, because with the addition of the American scenes as well as having all Godzilla stuff happen and then Kong stuff happen, it ultimately works for the film because it feels like it takes longer for them to get to the island, find Kong, see that fight with the octopus, and then bring Kong back. And I like that better because, again, it's a little more realistic. Rather than what we have in the Japanese cut of both things happening strangely at the same time, and one seems like it had to be moving slower. Just the American cut moves more smoothly, and I like that about it as well. The other big difference, and this is a continuity thing, and this is ultimately a problem with the American cut, is the fact that Gigantus the Fire Monster wasn't a Godzilla movie. This film is not in continuity with Godzilla. Well, the American cut is not in continuity with Godzilla Raids Again, because Godzilla Raids Again wasn't released in America. So all the references to Godzilla being frozen in ice and them talking about we knew he was going to come back eventually is all cut out. And there's different stuff put in now of suspended animation and Godzilla being frozen for like 100 million years or something. Here's the problem with it all. I wouldn't mind it if this was the first time anyone had ever seen this thing called Godzilla. Here's the problem. The minute Godzilla bursts out of the ice, they say it's Godzilla and have no question about what it is. Here's the thing. If you're going to tell me that the Raids Again Godzilla didn't happen and we just had King of the Monsters, fine, but it doesn't make any sense in my mind, because I wouldn't think that they would immediately jump to the conclusion of this being Godzilla after so many years. With the Japanese version of Raids Again, it was 1 year later. I mean, Tokyo was barely even kind of rebuilt, so it made more sense to me that they would know it was Godzilla right away. With this is 6 years later, and it ultimately doesn't make any sense. And all this talk about the suspended animation and talking about what Godzilla is just bogus. And all the scenes with the paleontologist Dr. Johnson, especially the ones where he's trying to explain what Godzilla is, talking about how he's a cross between several different dinosaurs, not even mentioning the allegory kind of thing, and talking about the suspended animation, it's all bogus. Because it was all expounded in King of the Monsters, which this film must be in continuity with at least, because they immediately call the thing Godzilla, so they have to have some basis for Godzilla attacks in the past. So it doesn't make any sense to me that they would be explaining this new origin for Godzilla, and it's just stupid. Ultimately, the film is that way because it is 6 years later, and I think the film is just paranoid that, or the American producers are paranoid that American audiences are too stupid to realize that Godzilla's had a movie before this, at least released in America. And I ultimately feel like it's just there for the sake of exposition, of making people aware of what Godzilla is. And ultimately, this film is the American cut more so than the Japanese cut, is extremely standalone. It is basically just a reboot for both Godzilla and Kong. Kong stuff is ultimately intact in the Japanese version because he had a reboot in that anyway, but Godzilla feels rebooted in this film. And I don't think that's a good thing, because you're giving your audience less credit that they're going to remember a movie that came out 6 years ago. So I don't like that. And ultimately, I don't like the bad continuity. I don't have a ton else to say about this movie. The one other difference that is a praise for the film is, I mentioned this earlier, so let's talk about the new music score, or I should say, different music score. I don't want to say new. All of Ifukube's music is cut out. All his Godzilla themes, all the new stuff he made is all cut out. And when I heard about that, I was immediately pissed off, because I was like, oh my god, you cut out all of Ifukube's music, what's wrong with you? His music is great. Then I saw the Japanese version, and I was like, the music is good, but it doesn't fit the movie at all. And then we come to the American cut with all the stock Creature from the Black Lagoon and Wolfman music, and I gotta say, it ultimately works better than Ifukube's soundtrack for this film. And the big reason for me is because it almost represents the American Mickey Mouse score effect, which we have with the original King Kong, where the music is composed to kind of represent the characters in the film doing stuff. Japanese music works a little differently, but American soundtracks work this way, where the music is supposed to complement what the characters are doing. And in Gojira and Raids Again, that wasn't a problem because the movies were just trying to be epics. With King Kong vs. Godzilla, I didn't feel like it was trying to be an epic, because we've got these more cartoony monster battle scenes where the monsters are doing some things that are a little comical. And they're doing these very specific moves. You know, like when Godzilla getting pissed off about Kong throwing a rock at him and all that stuff. With the American cut, whenever the characters in the film are doing something that's notable, the music complements what they're doing, and I'll try to point out examples. The big one that always stuck out to me was Godzilla knocking Kong down into a rock and knocking Kong out. When Kong tries, this is the first time this happens, because it happens twice in the fight, but the first time Godzilla knocks Kong out, Kong tries to get up one more time and then he just falls back down. And in the Japanese version, it's just a straight music score. There's nothing representing what the characters are doing. With the American cut, there's this little rise and fall that I love when Kong tries to get up. It's not hilarious, it's not funny, but it fits. And ultimately, I like the fact that the music is complementing what the characters are doing. And with Ifukube's score for King Kong vs. Godzilla in the Japanese cut, it didn't really have that. And I hate to say that, because this is all stock music. This is all stuff that wasn't even made for Godzilla. And Ifukube's stuff was. But I'm not just going to pander to Ifukube's soundtrack because I'm an Ifukube fan. I'm going to ultimately have to be objective and say that this film, the music works better and complements the film better. All the little rises and falls and all the straight epic scores work for their individual scenes. There's also this great crescendo where when Kong is being picked up by the balloons, which is, it's almost like it gets bigger as Kong gets higher. It's so cool. I also really like the Creature from the Black Lagoon's theme is a very specific theme that everyone knows if you're into monster movies, and somehow it doesn't bother me when it's used when the monsters do something epic. Like when Kong bursts out of the water after trying to be blown up on the raft, the Creature from the Black Lagoon's theme plays, and it doesn't matter. It fits what Kong's doing. And the same music plays when Godzilla rises from the pit unscathed after the military tries to use their trap on him. And again, I don't care that it's stock because it fits. So I'm sorry, I love Ifukube, but the score for the American cut just ultimately fits the movie better. And again, I hate to say that because it's all stock music, but I ultimately feel like they tried, the American company tried very hard to make the music fit the scenes, and they ultimately succeeded, and it works. So again, sorry, Ifukube fans, I'm one of you, but his score for the Japanese cut didn't fit the movie, and this does. So I like the music score for King Kong vs. Godzilla, the American cut, better. The last thing I want to cover is the ending. This has been one of the most biggest misconceptions in all of film history. I mean, if you just type in King Kong vs. Godzilla on Google or Ask.com, this is one of the first questions that pops up. Does Godzilla win in the Japanese version, and does Kong win in the American version? And the answer is no, Kong wins in both versions. I don't know where this started, but it's been going on for almost 40, this is 2012, so exactly 40 years. Oh, I just realized this is the movie's 40th anniversary. Why the fuck didn't anyone do a DVD special? Fuckers. Sorry, I love this movie so much. I wish they would have done something for its 40th anniversary. Maybe they did in Japan. I don't live in Japan, so maybe they did in Japan and I just can't get my hands on it because I'm an American. And Universal, we'll talk about this briefly, but Universal released the American version, and because all of their music and actors are in it, it's technically a Universal movie and not a Toho movie. So Universal has forbade Toho to release the Japanese version in America, so that's why all we have in the case of DVDs and VHS tapes is the American cut. So that's why, if you want to blame anyone for why we haven't seen the Japanese version, it's because of Universal. And ultimately, everyone thinks that Kong wins in this cut and Godzilla wins in the other cut. That's not true at all. Kong wins in both versions. And I think the reason why that started is because some kind of, I don't know, I guess some desire for international, this battle between, Japan and America, which one's better. I don't know why. But I think it was just because of, I guess it was international egotism, I guess is the way to put it. But basically, no, Kong wins in both cuts. And I think the ending solidifies this as a standalone movie because, again, it totally ends the story. Kong swims off to go on a happy ending, and everyone seems to think Godzilla's dead for some reason. I don't know why, but everyone thinks he's dead. The Japanese cut is a little bit more, I don't want to say open-ended, but because it's more specifically a Godzilla movie, and the Godzilla continuity in this film is so standalone that I feel like this movie, ultimately, with the ending of Kong winning, works as a really standalone movie. So I think that's really all I have to say about the American cut of King Kong vs. Godzilla. So thank you very much for sticking with me for both parts of this very nostalgic and hard-to-review duo of reviews on Godzilla Palooza Day 4. Before we go, I guess I'll rate the American cut separately, but ultimately I think that it is just as good as the Japanese cut. And ultimately, because we don't have a choice in the matter, if you're in America, you're going to have to watch the American cut, so no matter what cut you're watching, just watch one of them. I just prefer the American version because that's what I'm used to, and I think the music score is better. So, but ultimately, it doesn't matter. They're both very much so the same, so I'm going to give both cuts a 4 out of 5. They're both great monster movies. They both are riddled with problems, but ultimately, they all overcome them to form a cool monster movie. So that's really all I have to say. I would give both a 4 out of 5. I recommend both cuts. If you're a Godzilla completionist, I do recommend you watch both just for the experience of it. If you're just a moderate Godzilla fan and just want to see some version of this movie, just stick with the American version. It's all you got anyway. And really don't go out of your way to get the torrent, because ultimately it's not worth it. They're both very similar, and ultimately I think the American version works better. So I just say stick with the American cut, but again, if you're a Godzilla completionist, go down with the torrent. So that'll about do it for this review. So tomorrow on Godzilla Palooza, we are finally going to be leaving behind King Kong vs. Godzilla, and now we're going to start to get into the classics, the stuff that will define Showa series Godzilla. When we review the Japanese cut, we're not going to do separate reviews for this one, but we're going to review Mothra vs. Godzilla. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all tomorrow for a review of Mothra vs. Godzilla. Zazubaar out.